The room smelled of antiseptic and desperation. Machines hummed, monitors blinked, and the sterile silence of the private hospital suite was broken only by the shallow, uneven breaths of Charles Wentworth. His once commanding voice, the voice that had ordered mergers, dictated fortunes, and snapped empires into existence, was now reduced to faint groans that barely stirred the air. 20 doctors stood around his bed, each one renowned in their field, each one flown in at a cost only a billionaire could afford. They had gathered like soldiers on a battlefield, armed not with guns but with stethoscopes, charts, and technology. Yet for all their collective brilliance, they were powerless. Charles had been sick for weeks. What began as fatigue had spiraled into something inexplicable. His appetite waned, his strength drained away, and his body seemed to shrink into itself as though something unseen was feeding off him. His face, once sharp and defined, sagged, the skin pallid and thin like wax under dim light. His hair, always neatly combed back, lay damp against his forehead as sweat coated him despite the coolness of the room. The billionaire, who had once been described as larger than life, now seemed frighteningly small against the mountain of pillows that supported him. The doctors spoke in low tones, their voices threaded with tension. Liver function appears normal. No sign of malignancy. We've ruled out autoimmune conditions. It must be metabolic, perhaps something neurological. Their words floated like puzzle pieces with no hope of fitting together. They spoke in languages meant for journals, symposiums, and conferences, but none of it comforted the man gasping for air before them. They were afraid to admit what was obvious. They didn't know. Near the window stood his family. His eldest son, Victor, leaned casually against the wall, tapping away on his phone as though his father's decline was merely an inconvenient delay in his schedule. His daughter, Lillian, crossed her arms, her face sharp with impatience. 2 younger cousins whispered among themselves, their eyes darting to the monitors as though waiting for them to flatline. Their clothes were expensive, designer brands tailored to perfection, but their hearts seemed tailored only to greed. They weren't here to comfort their father or uncle. They were here because they smelled the blood of inheritance. In the corner of the room, silent as a shadow, stood Rosa. She wore her simple black and white uniform, her hair tucked into a neat bun, her hands folded in front of her. She had been Charles's housekeeper for 15 years, working quietly, faithfully, without complaint. To the family, she was furniture. To the doctors, she was irrelevant. But to Charles, she was a familiar presence, the only person who still touched his hand not with latex gloves but with warmth. Rosa had seen him at his best. She remembered mornings when he strode through the house in crisp suits, barking orders into his phone while his breakfast sat untouched. She remembered nights when he returned late, weary but proud, handing her a small smile before retreating to his study. She had watched him build his empire from the background, wiping the marble counters after his meetings, sweeping the hallways after his parties. She knew his habits, his moods, his rhythms, and because she knew, she noticed when something was off. Her eyes were sharp, trained not by books or medical school but by years of paying attention. She saw how Charles flinched whenever the curtains were opened too wide, as though the sunlight itself burned him. She noticed that his lips trembled more after meals, his skin paling within minutes of swallowing. She caught the faintest whiff of something unusual in his room. Not the sharpness of disinfectant, not the metallic tang of medicine, but something else that didn't belong. The doctors dismissed such details as trivial, but Rosa's instincts told her they mattered. That morning, as the doctors huddled near the monitors, Rosa stood close to the bed, pretending to adjust the blankets. Charles's fingers, cold and weak, brushed against hers. His eyes fluttered open, and for a fleeting moment recognition flickered in them. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. Rosa bent closer, her ear near his lips, catching fragments of words. Different. Not right. T. Then his eyes rolled back, and the machines beeped louder. No one else heard him. Or if they did, they didn't care. The head physician, a tall man with rimless glasses and a polished accent, tapped his pen against his clipboard. We may need to expand our testing. A rare mitochondrial disorder, perhaps. I'll have the lab run deeper panels. The others nodded in agreement, eager to appear decisive. Not one of them asked what Charles had tried to say. Rosa swallowed hard. She had grown up in a village where survival depended on noticing what others missed. Back then, a child who didn't notice a snake's shadow in the grass didn't survive the day. She had carried that instinct into adulthood, and now it screamed at her that something was wrong beyond what the doctors were seeing. As the hours passed, the room filled with the sterile routine of medicine. Nurses adjusted IV drips, doctors scribbled notes, machines beeped their steady rhythms. Family members checked their watches, bored, whispering about meetings and trips postponed, and Rosa stood still, a quiet sentinel, her mind racing. When lunch arrived, she watched closely. A tray of clear soup, steamed vegetables, and tea was brought in by a nurse. Charles, barely able to lift his hand, was fed spoonfuls by another. Rosa's eyes fixed on the cup of tea placed on the bedside table. She saw the steam curl upward, carrying with it a faint, bitter scent. No one else seemed to notice. She waited, watching. When the tea was lifted to Charles's lips, his expression shifted, a faint grimace. His hand twitched, almost as if resisting. But too weak to protest, he swallowed. Within minutes, his breathing grew ragged again, his skin damp with sudden sweat. The monitors reflected the change, heart rate fluttering, oxygen dipping. The doctors rushed to adjust medications, to reposition him, to recalibrate machines. They muttered about stress response and systemic fragility, but Rosa's mind connected the dots. It was the tea. Her heart pounded as realization set in. Could it be? Was something in his food or drink harming him, poisoning him slowly, drop by drop? She had no proof, no authority, and no one would listen. If she spoke now, she would be ridiculed, dismissed as a superstitious maid meddling in matters beyond her station. She could almost hear the mocking laughter of Victor and Lillian if she dared voice her suspicion. And yet, she couldn't ignore it. That night, when the doctors left and the family retreated to their expensive suites in the hospital wing, Rosa stayed behind. She had asked quietly if she could remain, claiming she wanted to watch over Mr. Wentworth. The nurses agreed. They knew she was devoted, harmless. Rosa sat in the dim glow of the monitors, her eyes never leaving Charles's frail frame. Every sound in the room etched itself into her memory. The steady hum of the oxygen, the faint drip of the IV, the occasional sigh of the old man. She thought of her own father, long gone, who had once told her, "Pay attention to the world, Rosa. It always tells you what's wrong if you're willing to listen." Tonight, the world was screaming at her through the smallest details. The bitter scent of tea, the sudden decline after meals, the whispers of words from a man too weak to shout. In the stillness of the night, she made a decision. She would watch every detail. She would not let her silence become the reason he died. Even if they mocked her, even if they told her to leave her place, she would act. By dawn, Charles's condition had worsened further. The doctors returned, more anxious than before, their discussions sharper, their tempers shorter. "We need more tests. This is unprecedented. We're missing something." Their frustration filled the room like smoke. Choking reason. The family arrived, their faces masks of concern, but their eyes gleaming with calculation. Victor leaned over the bed, patting his father's hand with feigned affection, his gaze darting quickly to the monitors. "Hang in there, Dad. We're all here for you," he said, though his tone rang hollow. Rosa, standing nearby, saw it all. The false sympathy, the indifference, the greed. She clenched her fists. She didn't have their education, their money, or their power, but she had her eyes. And her eyes told her the truth. Something was happening right under everyone's noses. When the nurse set down another cup of tea by Charles's bed, Rosa's breath caught. The steam rose again, faintly bitter. She watched as a trembling hand reached for it, and in that moment she knew she could no longer remain silent. The morning light slipped through the hospital blinds in weak, pale streaks, the kind of light that made the air feel heavy rather than hopeful. Charles Wentworth's condition had steadied overnight but not improved, and the doctors shuffled in with tired eyes, their pristine coats no longer carrying the air of certainty they once did. Their charts were full, their tablets cluttered with numbers and lines, but not one of those lines pointed them toward a cure. The billionaire's body remained a mystery they could not unlock. His family stood stiffly near the window, murmuring about stocks and property portfolios. Their voices dipped low, but their intent shameless. They weren't here for him, Rosa thought as she quietly changed the linens at the foot of the bed. They were here for his absence. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the night before. Every detail of that teacup haunted her. The faint powder at the bottom, the bitter smell, the rapid decline in his breathing after he drank it. She had tried to convince herself it could be coincidence, That fatigue was making her suspicious of shadows, but she couldn't deny what her instinct screamed. Something was being fed to him that was slowly killing him. Gathering courage, Rosa waited for a pause in the doctor's conference at the side of the bed. When one of them finally closed his file with an exasperated sigh, she stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "Excuse me," she began, her accent soft and laced with the years she'd spent working in silence. "Something is wrong with his food." For a second, the room went still. All eyes turned to her, not with curiosity but with disdain. The head physician adjusted his glasses and frowned. "What did you say?" "His food," Rosa repeated a little stronger this time. "Or his drink. Every time he takes the tea, he gets worse." "I think," the physician raised a hand sharply, cutting her off. "We are medical professionals, madam, not servants of superstition. Please, leave the medical observations to those qualified to make them." A ripple of suppressed laughter passed through the younger doctors. Victor, leaning lazily in his chair, smirked. "Really, Rosa? Poisoned tea? What is this, some kind of village tale?" His sister snickered, their amusement cruel in its dismissal. Heat burned Rosa's face, shame pressing down on her shoulders. But inside, a fire was kindling. She wanted to shout at them, to tell them that none of their brilliance had kept Charles alive, that they had done nothing but poke and prod while he wasted away. Instead, she bit back her words, bowing her head and stepping back into silence. Yet silence didn't mean surrender. She knew her place in this world, seen but not heard, useful but invisible. And perhaps that invisibility was her strength. While the doctors paraded their intelligence and the family sharpened their claws over inheritance, Rosa moved quietly. She slipped into the kitchen later that day, her heart pounding as if she were a thief. The cooks were busy preparing trays for patients, their chatter loud enough to cover the sound of her movements. She found the teapot used for Charles's meals and peered inside. To the naked eye, nothing seemed wrong, just dark amber liquid with faint wisps of steam. But when she tilted the pot slightly, she saw it, a thin, powdery film clinging to the bottom, dissolving so faintly it might have gone unnoticed. Her chest tightened. It was real. That evening, Rosa refused to leave Charles's side. She sat by him, watching the nurses, her gaze fixed on every tray that entered the room. When his tea arrived again, she intercepted it before anyone could protest. "Let me," she whispered, taking the cup as if to help him drink. But instead, she set it quietly aside, replacing it with plain water she had poured herself. Charles's lips trembled as they closed around the glass, and for the first time in days, his breathing did not immediately spiral downward. She kept the teacup hidden, clutching it like evidence of a crime. When the shift changed and the doctors gathered for their nightly assessment, Rosa forced herself forward once more. "Please," she begged, holding out the cup. "Test this. Something is inside it." The head physician sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is absurd." But another doctor, younger and less jaded, glanced at her with faint curiosity. "There's no harm in testing it," he murmured, taking the cup from her hands. "To rule it out, if nothing else." The results came back hours later. The room was silent when the lab report landed on the table, its words stark and undeniable. Traces of a toxin administered in small, consistent doses, present in the tea residue. It wasn't the kind of poison that killed instantly, but the kind designed to weaken over time, to mimic illness, to baffle physicians who would search for everything except the obvious. Gasps echoed in the room. Rosa watched as the color drained from the faces of the doctors who had mocked her. The head physician stammered something about how rare the toxin was, how clever its use, but the shame in his eyes betrayed his words. For all their intelligence, they had missed what the maid had seen with her untrained eyes. The family's reaction was even sharper. Lillian covered her mouth in shock, but her eyes darted immediately toward her brother. Victor froze, his smirk gone, his jaw tightening. Rosa's gaze locked on him, and she saw it. The brief flicker of panic, the way his hand clenched into a fist, the way sweat broke out across his forehead. The doctors were too busy debating how the poison could have been administered to notice, but Rosa didn't miss it. She had spent her life reading people, knowing when they lied, when they hid, when they planned. She knew in her bones that Victor was not just a bystander, but how could she prove it? She was still just a housekeeper standing in the corner, dismissed as irrelevant. The toxin was real, but the hand that delivered it was still free. Later that night, as Charles dozed fitfully, Rosa sat awake in her chair, clutching her rosary between her fingers. She replayed every detail she had observed. The meals arriving, the cups replaced, the way Victor often insisted on personally checking on his father's food when the staff delivered it to the house, before he fell ill enough to be hospitalized. It all formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. She thought of Charles, the man who had never spoken cruelly to her, who had always nodded in greeting when others treated her as invisible. He had once told her during a quiet moment while she polished the library shelves that he valued loyalty above all else. "Money can buy brilliance, Rosa," he had said, "but not loyalty. That's the one thing no check can write." Now, as his life hung in the balance, Rosa understood those words in a way she never had before. Her loyalty had kept her silent for years, accepting her role without question. But now loyalty demanded something else. It demanded courage. The following day, Rosa watched carefully as Victor entered the room, his voice dripping with false concern. "How's the old man holding up?" he asked, but his eyes flickered toward the tray of food being set down. Rosa's pulse quickened. She saw the way he lingered, his hand brushing against the cup for just a second too long, as if making sure it was there. She knew then. It was him, but knowing was not enough. She needed proof, something undeniable. And so Rosa devised a plan. That evening, when the next meal arrived, she pretended to step out, leaving the tray untouched on the side table. From the hallway, through the slight crack of the door, she watched. It didn't take long. Victor slipped in moments later, glancing around before leaning over the tray. From her hidden vantage point, Rosa saw his hand move swiftly, sprinkling something into the tea, stirring it quickly before retreating. Her heart thundered. She had seen it with her own eyes. When Victor left, she entered again, her steps quiet but purposeful. She picked up the cup, careful not to disturb the contents. This time, she didn't wait to ask permission. She went directly to the young doctor who had believed her before, showing him the cup. "Test this," she demanded, her voice stronger than it had ever been. The results confirmed everything. The toxin matched the residue from before, freshly added. There was no denying it now. The poison was not an accident, not contamination, but deliberate. Someone was trying to kill Charles Wentworth. The doctors were stunned. Hospital security was summoned, and whispers of investigation spread quickly through the corridors. But Rosa didn't need to wait for their conclusions. She had seen Victor's face when the first report came back, had watched his hand tremble when the evidence mounted. She knew who was responsible, and when the police finally arrived, it was Rosa's calm, unwavering testimony that tipped the balance. She told them what she had seen, what she had smelled, what she had noticed day after day while others ignored the signs. She described Victor's actions with precise detail, each word stripping away the veneer of innocence he tried to maintain. Victor scoffed, laughed even, trying to dismiss her as just a housekeeper with wild suspicions. But when the lab tests matched her words exactly, his laughter died. The smug heir who thought he was untouchable found himself cornered, his excuses collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth, and Rosa, once invisible, stood in the center of it all, the one who had seen what 20 doctors had missed, the one who had given voice to the truth no one wanted to hear. The hospital corridors echoed with a strange silence after the discovery. Word spread quickly among the staff, not through loud declarations but through hushed conversations that carried a mix of shock and awe. The billionaire no doctor could save was not dying from some rare, incurable disease. It was poison, and someone close to him had been orchestrating his slow descent toward death. That revelation changed the air itself. The sterile halls now buzzed with the weight of suspicion, the gravity of betrayal. Rosa sat by Charles's bed, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had told the truth. She had shown them what they needed to see, but still she felt restless. She knew the poison had been entering his body by design, not chance, and she knew who had delivered it. Yet the thought of what came next made her stomach knot. Victor was not just a spoiled heir. He was clever, manipulative, a man used to getting away with whatever he wanted. Would they really believe the word of a housekeeper against his? Would her courage collapse under his wealth and influence? Charles stirred weakly, his voice hoarse but clear enough for her to hear. "You stayed." His eyes, though tired, carried gratitude. Rosa leaned forward, brushing the back of his hand with hers. a gesture that had become second nature. "I stayed because someone must," she whispered. He tried to smile, though the effort was too much for his fragile body. She wondered if he knew, deep down, who wanted him gone. Later that day, hospital security and police officers gathered in the room, their presence heavy with authority. The doctors stood awkwardly at the side, their pride bruised, their earlier dismissals of Rosa now hanging around their necks like chains. One of the officers spoke firmly, his eyes scanning the family members who had assembled. "We have reason to believe Mr. Wentworth has been the victim of deliberate poisoning. We are launching a formal investigation. No one is to interfere with his meals or medications until cleared by staff." The words sliced through the room like a blade. Lillian gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest as though her heart were breaking. But Rosa noticed the way she sneaked a glance at Victor, quick and anxious. Victor, however, stood perfectly still, his expression cool, almost bored. Only the slight twitch of his jaw betrayed him. "I find this accusation insulting," he declared. "Are we really supposed to believe my father? A man with access to the finest healthcare is being poisoned under everyone's nose. By who, a phantom? Or are we going to pretend this maid knows more than 20 specialists?" He gestured at Rosa with a sneer. "This is absurd." The officer's gaze hardened. "This maid, as you call her, has brought forward evidence that has been confirmed by laboratory tests. We have recordings from the hospital's surveillance system as well. You'll understand if we don't dismiss her so quickly." That was the moment Victor's confidence cracked. It was slight. His eyes flickered. His lips parted as though to respond, then pressed into a tight line. Rosa saw it, and she knew the truth had finally cornered him. The investigation moved quickly. The cameras revealed Victor entering the kitchen areas unaccompanied, something no family member had reason to do. They showed him lingering near the trays, his hands moving subtly, his presence always coinciding with the meals brought to his father. The evidence was damning, but it was Rosa's testimony that gave it context. She described what she had seen, what she had smelled, the changes in Charles's body after each sip of tea. Every detail matched what the lab confirmed. Victor's protests grew desperate. He accused Rosa of lying, of planting evidence, of conspiring to ruin him. He claimed she was bitter after years of servitude and wanted to manipulate her way into Charles's fortune. But no amount of shouting, no sneering remarks could erase the truth the tests had revealed. And the more he protested, the more guilty he appeared. When the police finally placed handcuffs around his wrists, Victor erupted in fury, his voice echoing down the corridor. "You think you've won?" He shouted at Rosa, his eyes burning with hatred. "You're nothing, a maid. You think saving him changes who you are? When he's gone, you'll go back to scrubbing floors where you belong." Rosa did not flinch. She met his rage with quiet steadiness, her voice calm as she replied, "Better to scrub floors with clean hands than live with blood on them." The officers led him away, his insults fading into the distance until only silence remained. Lillian sat trembling, her facade of shock slipping as she realized her brother's arrest would stain the family's reputation forever. The cousins whispered nervously, their earlier talk of inheritance now swallowed by fear. And Rosa turned back to Charles, whose weary eyes glistened with unspoken relief. Days passed, and with each one Charles grew stronger. Freed from the poison, his body began to heal. Color returned slowly to his cheeks. His breathing steadied, and though he remained weak, he was alive. Truly alive, for the first time in months. The doctors, humbled, shifted their focus to helping him recover instead of searching for phantom diseases. They no longer dismissed Rosa when she spoke. Some even nodded to her with genuine respect, though shame still lingered in their eyes. Charles often asked for Rosa to stay by his side. In those quiet hours, he confided in her, telling her things he had never said to anyone else. "I built empires, Rosa," he murmured one evening, his voice low. "But I forgot that empires crumble from within, not without. I trusted the wrong people." He squeezed her hand gently. "Except you. You saw what no one else would." Rosa listened, her heart heavy yet proud. She had not sought recognition. She had only wanted to protect the man who had shown her kindness when others had treated her as invisible. Yet here he was, speaking to her not as a servant but as an equal, perhaps even more than that, as family. When Charles was finally discharged from the hospital, the media swarmed. The story had leaked. The billionaire nearly killed by his own son, saved not by his team of experts but by the quiet watchfulness of his housekeeper. Reporters clamored for details, their cameras flashing, their voices shouting questions. Rosa, overwhelmed, tried to shrink into the background, but Charles pulled her forward, standing tall despite his frailty. "This woman," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that once commanded boardrooms, "saved my life. 20 doctors missed what she saw. She protected me when even my own blood betrayed me. From this day forward, she is not my servant, she is my family." The crowd erupted, questions flying, but Charles ignored them. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with emotions she had long kept buried. For years she had been the silent observer, the one who swept and dusted and faded into the background. Now the world was seeing her, not as a maid but as the woman who had stood where others had failed. Life changed swiftly after that. Rosa no longer returned to her small quarters tucked away in the back of the mansion. Charles moved her into a guest suite, insisting she live comfortably. He gave her a place at his table, her chair no longer the one pulled into corners but one beside him. At first she resisted, uncomfortable with the sudden shift, but Charles would hear none of it. "You've earned more than I could ever give," he said, "but let me try." As months passed, Charles regained much of his strength. His business associates returned, his empire thrived, but his priorities had shifted. He invested more in people than in profits, funding programs for those overlooked and unheard, much as Rosa had once been. And at every event, every gathering, she stood near him, not in uniform, but in clothes he insisted she choose for herself, her presence a reminder of loyalty and truth. Victor's trial was swift and brutal. The evidence left little room for defense. He was convicted, his name dragged through the mud of tabloids and news outlets, his arrogance crumbling into disgrace. Lillian tried to distance herself, but the stain of betrayal clung to the family. Charles, however, no longer cared. He had learned the hard way who truly mattered. One evening, long after the frenzy of the scandal had faded, Charles sat with Rosa on the balcony of his estate, the sun setting over the city he had once ruled with an iron grip. His voice was quiet, contemplative. "Do you know, Rosa, I used to think power was the greatest shield a man could have. But in the end, it wasn't power that saved me. It was you, a woman the world overlooked." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes the sharpest eyes don't belong to those with degrees or titles. They belong to those who care enough to see." Rosa looked at him, her heart full, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to believe that her worth had nothing to do with the uniform she wore, or the silence she kept. She had saved a life, uncovered betrayal, and changed the course of her own destiny. And so the story ended not with doctors taking credit, not with heirs fighting for wealth, but with a housekeeper whose loyalty had revealed a truth that money, power, and brilliance could not. The billionaire lived, the betrayer fell, and the woman who had once been invisible stood in the light, no longer unseen but unforgettable.